The phone didn't just ring, it sliced through the heavy, lemon scented stillness of the afternoon like a razor through silk. I was standing in the kitchen, my fingers curled around the comforting weight of a navy blue ceramic mug, a piece we'd picked up on a whim during a rainy weekend in Carmel a decade ago. The steam from my Earl Grey rose in a lazy, translucent ribbon, catching the golden slant of the 3 o'clock sun that hit the linoleum. For a moment, I didn't move. I simply listened to the rhythmic, authoritative tock tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that usually acted as the heartbeat of our home, but now felt like a countdown to something I couldn't name. The house felt cavernous, a shell of its usual self. It's strange how a person's presence occupies physical volume, how David's absence over the last 3 days had allowed the shadows to stretch further and the air to grow denser. He was in Chicago, likely standing in a glass walled conference room at the Blackstone, sketching out the future of some municipal skyline with that focused, silver browed intensity I had come to adore over 20 years of marriage. I could still see him at the airport, the scratchy texture of his charcoal wool coat as I leaned into him, the scent of cedarwood and expensive espresso clinging to his skin, and the way he'd tucked a loose strand of my hair behind my ear before whispering that he'd be home Friday. I set the mug down on the counter, the ceramic clicking against the granite with a sharp, lonely sound. The caller ID on the wall mounted handset read First National Trust. I frowned, smoothing my palm over the front of my apron. We had been with First National since we bought this house, back when the walls were bare and our dreams were loud. I picked up the receiver, expecting a routine inquiry about a suspicious charge or a courtesy call regarding our savings. "Hello, this is Evelyn Vance," I said, my voice sounding thin and unfamiliar in the quiet kitchen. "Mrs. Vance, good afternoon." "This is Marcus from the fraud department at the downtown branch," the voice on the other end said. He sounded young, professional, but there was an odd, strained clip to his words. "I'm calling to verify a high-value withdrawal request. We have a gentleman here, your husband, David Vance, requesting a transfer of the entirety of your joint liquid assets into a private offshore holding." My heart did a slow, sickening roll in my chest. I looked toward the hallway, where the lemon wax on the sideboard gleamed under the portrait of us on our wedding day. "I'm sorry, Marcus, but that's impossible. My husband is in Chicago. He's been there since Sunday for an architectural conference." There was a pause on the line, a silence so profound I could hear the faint, electronic hum of the bank's cooling systems. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had dropped an octave, losing its professional sheen. It was replaced by something that sounded like genuine, cold-blooded confusion. "Mrs. Vance," he whispered, "I don't understand. I'm looking right at him. He's sitting in my office across from me. He just handed me his passport and his driver's license. He's wearing a navy suit and a silver wedding band." I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold sensation like ice water trickling down my spine. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard the granite bit into my palm. "No," I breathed, my eyes darting to the empty hallway, to the coat rack where David's spare raincoat still hung, limp and lifeless. "He's in Chicago. I spoke to him this morning. He was eating breakfast at the hotel." "Mrs. Vance," Marcus said, and I could hear the sound of a chair creaking, the muffled rustle of paper. "I'm looking at his ID right now. It's him. He's right here. In fact, he told me you were expecting this. He said you were right there with him. He told me my wife is standing right behind me, Marcus. She'll vouch for the signature." "Mrs. Vance, are you not with your husband right now?" The room seemed to tilt. The ticking of the clock grew deafening, a hammer striking an anvil. I looked into the empty living room, at the pillows I had just straightened, at the rugs I had smoothed, and for a terrifying, fleeting second, I felt the phantom weight of a presence in the house that shouldn't be there. Your husband is here with you right now, Marcus repeated, his voice trembling. That's what he told me. He said you were right behind him. I didn't scream, I couldn't. My lungs felt like they had been filled with the very lemon wax that scented the air. I turned slowly, my back to the counter, looking toward the dark mouth of the hallway that led to our bedroom. The house was silent, save for the clock. But then, from the top of the stairs, I heard it. The unmistakable, heavy creak of the floorboard David always stepped on to avoid the squeak. And then a voice, David's voice, warm and resonant, drifted down from the shadows of the upper landing. Evelyn, honey, who are you talking to? The phone felt like a laid weight in my hand, a piece of plastic that had suddenly become the only anchor tethering me to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. My heart didn't just beat, it thrashed against my ribs like a panicked bird in a cage. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. The air in the kitchen, once smelling of home and safety, and the faint, citrusy tang of the lemon wax I'd used on the sideboard, now felt thick and unbreathable, like I was inhaling silt. I looked up at the landing. From my vantage point at the foot of the stairs, I could see the polished mahogany banister curving upward into the shadows of the second floor. And there, standing just at the edge of the light spilling from the guest room, was a figure. It was David. It was undeniably, impossibly David. He was wearing his favorite navy cashmere sweater, the one with the tiny, persistent pill on the left cuff that he refused to let me shave off because he said it gave the garment character. His hair, that salt and pepper thicket I loved to run my fingers through, was slightly mussed, as if he'd just woken up from a nap. He looked down at me with an expression of mild domestic curiosity, his head tilted in that specific way he did when he was waiting for me to finish a thought. Evelyn. He repeated, his voice vibrating through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. Who is it, honey? Is everything okay? Mrs. Vance, are you still there? Marcus's voice crackled in my ear, tinny and frantic. The sound was a jagged contrast to the calm resonance of the man on the stairs. Please talk to me. The security guards are approaching him now. He's looking right at me, Mrs. Vance. He's smiling. He just pointed behind him and said, see, she's right there. Tell him, Evelyn, tell him we need the money for the lake house. The lake house. We had talked about it for years. A quiet retreat in Michigan, a place with a wrap-around porch and a dock where David could fish and I could paint. It was our secret, a dream we'd whispered about in the dark of our bedroom, tucked away from the rest of the world. How could a stranger at a bank downtown know about the lake house? I looked back at the man on the landing. He took a step down, the old wood of the fifth step giving its familiar rhythmic groan. He gripped the banister, his knuckles pale against the dark wood. On his left hand, the gold of his wedding band caught the dim afternoon light, a perfect circle of promise that felt like a noose. I have to go, Marcus, I whispered into the receiver, my voice a ghost of itself. Wait, don't hang up, Marcus shouted, his professional veneer completely shattered. If you aren't here and he says you are. Mrs. Vance, stay on the line. I'm calling the police on my other line right. I clicked the talk button, severing the connection. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. I stood in the center of my kitchen, the phone still clutched to my chest, staring up at the man who looked like my husband, who sounded like my husband, and who was currently descending the stairs toward me with a gentle, concerned smile. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said, reaching the bottom step. He smelled of cedarwood and the expensive espresso he'd had before he supposedly left for the airport. It was a scent I knew better than my own. He reached out, his hand steady and warm, and brushed a stray lock of hair from my forehead. His touch was electric, sending a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through my veins. Who was on the phone? Evie. My tongue felt like a dry stone in my mouth. I wanted to scream, to run, to demand to know who he was, but the sheer domesticity of the moment, the way he called me Evie, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners held me paralyzed. If this was David, then who was at the bank? And if this wasn't David, what was standing in my kitchen wearing my husband's skin? It was the bank. I managed to choke out, my eyes searching his face for any flicker of deceit, any microscopic flaw that would give him away. But there was nothing. Every pore, every fine line around his eyes, every silver hair in his beard was exactly as it should be. He frowned, his brow furrowing in a way that was so familiar it made my stomach turn. The bank, did something happen with the Chicago wire? I told them I'd handle it once I got to the hotel, but the Wi-Fi on the plane was spotty. The plane, he was supposed to be in Chicago. He was supposed to be 1,000 miles away. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:14 p.m. Flight had landed 2 hours ago. I had received a text from him, landed, heading to the Hilton. Miss you already. David, I said, my voice trembling so hard the name was barely recognizable. Why aren't you in Chicago? He laughed, a soft, rich sound that usually filled me with warmth but now felt like ice water. He stepped closer, entering my personal space, the heat of his body radiating against mine. Chicago, honey, what are you talking about? The conference was pushed to next month. I told you that this morning over coffee. Don't tell me you've already forgotten our staycation plans. He reached out and took the phone from my limp hand, setting it gently on the granite counter. His movements were fluid, practiced, the movements of a man who owned this space, who belonged here. He wrapped his arms around my waist, drawing me into a hug that should have been comforting but felt like being held by a predator. You're trembling, he whispered into my hair, his breath warm against my ear. You've been working too hard. Why don't I make us some tea and you can tell me what that man at the bank was really bothering you about? Across town, Marcus was looking at a man who claimed I was standing right behind him. Here, in my own home, I was being held by a man who claimed he'd never left. I closed my eyes, the darkness behind my eyelids offering no escape, only the haunting image of two identical faces, both claiming to be the man I loved and both waiting for me to decide which one was the lie. I stood frozen, my back pressed against the cold edge of the granite countertop, watching him. He moved with a terrifyingly casual grace toward the stove, his hand reaching for the kettle as if it were any other Tuesday afternoon. I watched the familiar cadence of his gait, the way he navigated the narrow space between the island and the refrigerator with the mindless grace of a man who had lived in this house for a decade. He knew exactly where the tea bags were kept, the third cabinet from the left, tucked behind the fancy honey we'd bought in Vermont. He knew which burner on the stove was the temperamental one that required a second turn of the dial to ignite. Earl Grey, right? He asked, his voice over his shoulder light and conversational. You've looked a bit peaked all morning, Evie. I think the stress of the Vance merger is finally catching up to you. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in the cage of my ribs, its wings beating against my lungs until I could barely draw a full breath. I looked at the phone sitting on the counter, just inches from my hand. I needed to pick it up. I needed to scroll back through my messages and find the proof. I had seen the text. I had felt the vibration in my pocket while I was watering the ferns on the porch. Landed, heading to the Hilton, miss you already. Those words were burned into the back of my retinas. But as I watched him lean against the counter, waiting for the water to boil, his expression was one of such pure, guileless concern that I began to doubt my own sanity. The sunlight streaming through the kitchen window caught the fine, silver hairs at his temples. I found myself searching for a seam, some sign that this was a mask, a prosthetic, a trick of the light, but the skin was real. I could see the tiny, crescent-shaped scar on his chin from a childhood bike accident. I could see the way his pulse thrummed rhythmically in the hollow of his throat. If this was a lie, it was a lie written into his very DNA. David, I whispered, the name feeling like a jagged shard of glass in my throat. Show me your phone. The kettle began to whistle, a low, mournful sound that quickly rose to a piercing shriek. He didn't jump. He simply reached out and turned off the flame, the sudden silence that followed feeling even more violent than the noise. He turned to face me fully, his brow arched in mild confusion. My phone, it's in my jacket pocket on the banister. Why? He took a step toward me, his hands held out in a placating gesture. Evie, you're white as a sheet. Talk to me. What did that person from the bank say? Did they mention the lake house? Because if there's a problem with the title, I can call the lawyers right now. The man at the bank, I said, my voice gaining a desperate, hysterical edge, is you, David. He's standing in Marcus's office right now. He's wearing your blazer. He's tapping his ring on the desk. Marcus said I was standing right there with him. He paused, a slow, sad smile spreading across his face, the kind of smile you give to a child who has just described a nightmare. Oh, honey. Identity theft is a nightmare, I know. Someone must be using a deep fake or just a very good resemblance. But I'm right here. I've been here all day. We had breakfast at the diner, remember? The blueberry pancakes. I felt the room tilt. We hadn't gone to the diner. I had made him an omelet before he left for the airport. I remembered the smell of the sautéed peppers. I remembered him kissing the top of my head and complaining that the Uber was 5 minutes late. But as he spoke, a false memory tried to take root in my mind, a ghostly image of a blue vinyl booth and the smell of cheap maple syrup. It was as if his words were rewriting my history in real time. You're lying, I breathed, though the conviction was draining out of me, replaced by a cold, numbing dread. I saw you leave. I watched the car pull away. You were dreaming, Evie, he said softly, stepping into my space again. This time I didn't pull away, I couldn't. The sheer gravity of his presence was too strong. He reached out and cupped my face with both hands. His palms were warm, slightly calloused, and smelled faintly of the soap he liked. You've been having those vivid dreams again. The doctor said it might happen with the new medication. I'm not on any medication, I snapped, but even as the words left my lips, I looked toward the kitchen windowsill. There, sitting next to the African violet, was a small orange pill bottle I didn't recognize. My name was printed on the label in stark black letters. The world was fracturing. Somewhere across the city, a man who looked like my husband was trying to empty our accounts, and a man named Marcus was calling the police. But here, in the quiet of our kitchen, the man I loved was telling me I was sick, and the evidence of my own instability was staring me in the face. I looked back at the phone. It was silent. No more calls from the bank. No more tethers to the world I thought I knew. I was alone in a house with a man who was either my husband or a monster, and I was beginning to realize that the most terrifying possibility wasn't that he was a stranger. It was that he was the only version of David I had left. The man standing in my kitchen, the one who looked and smelled and sounded exactly like my husband of 24 years, reached out to touch my shoulder. I flinched, a visceral reaction that seemed to wound him. His hand hovered in the air for a second, fingers slightly curled, before he slowly withdrew it. He looked at the pill bottle on the windowsill and then back at me, his eyes swimming with a pity that made my skin crawl. Evie, please, he said, his voice a low, soothing baritone. You're shaking. Let's just sit down. I'll make some tea and we can call Dr. Aris together. He said the transition to the new dosage might be rocky. I didn't answer him. My mind was a frantic, divided thing, split into three impossible realities. There was the man in front of me, claiming we'd had blueberry pancakes at a diner that didn't exist in my memory. There was the man Marcus had described at the bank, tapping his wedding ring, the same gold band I could see on the hand of the man in my kitchen, and claiming I was standing right beside him. And then there was the voice still echoing in my ear from the call I had just ended minutes ago. When I had dialed David's cell, my heart had been hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. He had answered on the second ring, that familiar, slightly distracted hello that always meant he was multitasking. The background noise had been unmistakable, the high altitude chime of an airport terminal, the distant, garbled announcements of gates and boarding times. He had sounded so normal. He told me he was grabbing a coffee before his afternoon session in Chicago. He had called me sweetheart, the T at the end of the word softening into a breathy exhale the way it always did when he was tired. It was a cadence no deepfake could master, a rhythm of speech that was as unique to him as his thumbprint. I hadn't told the David on the phone about the bank call. I hadn't told him that I was currently staring at a man who wore his face like a second skin. I had just murmured something about missing him and hung up, the plastic of the phone feeling slick with my sweat. I needed to see the intruder for myself. I needed to see the man at the bank with my own eyes before I allowed my world to finish shattering. I have to go, I blurted out, my voice cracking. Go where? Kitchen David asked, his brow furrowed in genuine-looking alarm. Evie, you're in no state to drive. If you're worried about the bank, stay here. I'll call Marcus. I'll straighten it out. No. I snapped, the word sharper than I intended. I grabbed my purse from the counter, my fingers fumbling with the strap. I forgot I have an appointment for my hair. I'm late. It was a pathetic lie, one that hung in the air between us like a bad smell. David, the real David, knew I never forgot appointments. He knew I was the kind of person who arrived 10 minutes early for everything. But this man, this version of him, just nodded slowly, a look of profound sadness crossing his features. If that's what you need, he said softly. But please take the car with the better tires, the SUV, and call me when you get there. I didn't wait to respond. I pushed past him, my arm brushing against his sleeve. The fabric of his blazer was a heavy, expensive wool, the very one I had bought him for our anniversary. It felt real. He felt real. As I stepped out into the hallway, the house felt like it was breathing, the walls closing in on me. I grabbed my keys from the hook, the jingle of them sounding like a frantic alarm. I practically ran to the garage, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I climbed into the driver's seat of my sedan, ignoring his suggestion of the SUV, and locked the doors immediately. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. I looked at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing behind the car, but the garage was empty. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw him through the front window. He was standing in the living room, a silhouette framed by the lace curtains I had picked out 3 years ago. He wasn't moving. He was just watching me leave. The drive to the downtown branch usually took 15 minutes, but today every red light felt like an eternity, every slow-moving car a personal affront. My mind kept looping back to the phone call. Chicago. He was in Chicago. I had seen the flight confirmation. I had seen him pack his bag. I had felt the heat of his skin when we said goodbye. So who was at the bank and who was in my kitchen? The morning sun was blinding, reflecting off the windshields of passing cars, but the world felt gray, drained of its substance. I turned onto Main Street, the familiar storefronts, the bakery, the hardware store, the florist, passing by in a blur. I was looking for glitches, for seams in the fabric of the reality I was moving through. Was the sky the right shade of blue? Were the pedestrians moving at a natural pace? I pulled into the parking lot of the bank, my heart rate spiking until I could feel the pulse in my eyeballs. The building was a cold, imposing structure of granite and glass. Somewhere inside, a man with my husband's face was waiting. Marcus was waiting, and the version of me that was supposed to be there, the ghost Evelyn, was waiting too. I turned off the engine but stayed in the car for a moment, my forehead resting against the cool arc of the steering wheel. I could still hear the Chicago David's voice in my head. See you tomorrow, sweetheart. It was a tether, the only thing keeping me from drifting away into the madness. I took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped the perspiration from my upper lip, and opened the door. The heat of the pavement rose up to meet me, but I felt cold to the bone. I walked toward the heavy brass doors of the bank, my legs feeling like lead, my vision narrowing until all I could see was the entrance. I was going to walk in there and I was going to find out which part of my life was a lie, and I was terrified that the answer would be all of it. The brass handles of the bank's double doors were scorched by the midday sun, the heat biting into my palms as I gripped them. It felt like a warning, a physical barrier trying to keep me from the truth, but I pulled with a strength born of pure, unadulterated terror. As I crossed the threshold, the transition was jarring. The humid, heavy air of the street was instantly replaced by a clinical, refrigerated chill that made the sweat on my neck turn to needles of ice. The lobby was a cavern of polished granite and hushed whispers, the kind of place where money is treated with the reverence of a religion. My heels struck the marble floor with a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks that sounded like gunshots in the stillness. I felt exposed, a frantic woman in a temple of order, my hair likely wild and my eyes wide with a desperation I couldn't hide. I didn't stop at the teller line. I didn't look at the velvet ropes or the digital displays flashing interest rates. My eyes were locked on the glass-walled offices at the far end of the hall. That was where Marcus sat, the man who had known us for 15 years, the man who had helped us secure our first mortgage and set up our retirement accounts. He was the gatekeeper of our financial life, a man of meticulous detail and unwavering sobriety. If he said David was there, then in some terrifying, impossible way, David was there. As I approached, I saw them. Marcus was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, his brow furrowed as he looked over a set of documents. And across from him, sitting in one of the leather guest chairs, was a man. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, the fabric catching the overhead fluorescent light with a subtle, expensive sheen. It was the suit David had bought for the merger meetings in Chicago, a bespoke piece with a faint pinstripe that was almost invisible unless you were standing close enough to touch him. From the back, the silhouette was hauntingly perfect. The way his shoulders set, the slight line to the left that David always adopted when he was focused, the way his hair, salt and pepper, trimmed close at the nape, caught the light. My breath hitched, a jagged sound that felt like it was tearing my throat. I thought of the man I had just left in our kitchen, the one who had offered me tea and looked at me with such heartbreaking concern. Then I thought of the David I had spoken to on the phone, the one who was supposed to be 1,000 miles away, surrounded by the noise of a Chicago terminal. My mind was a kaleidoscope of Davids, each one shifting and blurring into the next until I didn't know which one was the anchor and which were the shadows. I remembered the scar, the tiny, silvered crescent on his chin where he'd hit the pavement after falling off his bike at 10 years old. I remembered the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners, a map of 20 years of shared laughter and stresses. I knew every mole, every line, every hesitation in his gait. I was his wife. I was the keeper of his history. No one could fool me, not if I looked him in the eye. Marcus looked up then, his eyes widening behind his thin-rimmed spectacles. He looked at me, then his gaze darted to the man in the chair, then back to me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out for a long, agonizing second. He looked like a man watching a glitch in the universe happen in real time. Evelyn, he finally managed, his voice thin and wavering. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, the sound echoing through the glass walls. I thought you were just here. I mean, the man in the charcoal suit began to turn. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a movement I had seen every morning for 2 decades when he turned to greet me over coffee. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. I braced myself for a stranger, for a monster, for a void. But as he turned his head, the profile coming into view, the straight nose, the familiar set of the jaw, the slight shadow of a midday beard, my world didn't just tilt, it inverted. It was him. It was David. Not a likeness, not a cousin, not a clever imitation. It was the man I had married. He looked at me, and for a heartbeat, there was nothing but the familiar warmth I had known for half my life. But then a look of profound, chilling confusion crossed his face. He didn't stand up to hug me. He didn't smile. He just stared at me as if I were a ghost. Evie, he whispered, his voice the exact timbre of the man who had tucked me in last night. What are you doing here? You're at home. You told me you were staying home today. The air in the office felt like it was being sucked out by a vacuum. I looked at his hands, the gold wedding band I had placed there, the small freckle on his thumb. Everything was right, everything was perfect. And that was the most terrifying thing of all, because if this was David, then who was the man in my kitchen, and who was the man on the phone? I felt the floor beneath me turn to liquid, the solid granite of the bank dissolving into a dreamscape where nothing had weight and no one had a name. I reached out for the edge of the doorway to steady myself, my fingers slipping on the cold glass. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation from the universe, but my voice was gone, buried under the weight of a reality that had finally, irrevocably broken. I just saw you, I whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. I just left you in the kitchen. You were wearing your blazer. You were making tea. The David in the charcoal suit stood up slowly, his face pale. He looked at Marcus, who was gripped by a visible tremor. Evie, honey, I've been here for 40 minutes. Marcus can tell you we've been going over the joint trust. He has, Marcus choked out, his eyes darting between us. He's been right here, Evelyn, and you were here 10 minutes before he arrived. You signed the entry log. You sat right where he's sitting. I looked down at the desk. There was a pen, a heavy silver fountain pen that belonged to the bank. Next to it was a signature card. I leaned forward, my vision tunneling until all I could see was the ink on the paper. There in the familiar, loopy script I had practiced in high school and perfected over decades of marriage was my name, Evelyn Vance. The ink was still fresh, shimmering slightly under the lights. I didn't sign that, I said, my voice rising. I wasn't here. I was at home. I was talking to you on the phone, David. You were in Chicago. The man in the suit took a step toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Chicago, Evie, the trip was canceled. I told you that last night. We had dinner at Mario's, remember? We talked about the kitchen remodel. I backed away, my heel catching on the carpet. The memory he was describing felt real. I could almost taste the garlic from the pasta, hear the ambient noise of the restaurant, but it was layered over another memory, one where he was packing a suitcase and kissing me goodbye at the door. Two lives were occupying the same space in my head, grinding against each other like tectonic plates. No, I sobbed, shaking my head violently. No, that's not what happened. You're not. I turned and ran. I didn't care about Marcus or the bank or the charcoal suit. I burst through the glass doors, the heat of the afternoon hitting me like a physical blow. I scrambled into my car, my breath coming in ragged, desperate lunges. I had to get home. I had to see the other one. I had to find the man in the kitchen and demand to know which of them was the lie. As I tore out of the parking lot, my phone began to ring. It was sitting in the cup holder, the screen glowing with a malevolent light. The caller ID read David. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because as I looked at the phone, a text message popped up from the same number. Evie, why did you leave the bank? I'm standing here with Marcus. Where are you going? At the same time, another notification chimed. A second text from the same contact name. I'm worried about you, sweetheart. The tea is getting cold. Please come back inside. The phone sat in the cup holder, vibrating with a rhythmic, mechanical persistence that felt like a heartbeat, not mine, but something colder, something synthetic. I stared at the screen, the blue light washing over my knuckles as I gripped the steering wheel so hard the skin went white and the bones felt like they might snap through the flesh. Two messages, two separate, impossible realities blinking up at me from the same contact name, David. My thumb hovered over the glass, trembling with a violence I couldn't control. I didn't open them. To open them would be to invite the madness inside, to give it a seat in the car beside me and let it whisper in my ear. I shoved the phone face down into the dark recess of the center console, but the vibration continued, buzzing against the hard plastic like a trapped, angry hornet, demanding my attention, demanding I choose which version of my husband was the lie. I accelerated, the engine of my SUV roaring in a guttural protest as I swerved onto the main road, the tires screaming against the asphalt. The world outside the windshield looked disturbingly, insultingly normal. A woman in a bright yellow windbreaker was walking her golden retriever, her face set in a mask of mourning boredom. A teenager was hunched over his bike at the corner of Elm, his thumbs flying across a screen. The sun was catching the chrome of passing cars with a cheerful, indifferent brilliance. How could the sky stay that particular shade of robin's egg blue when the very foundation of my life had just turned to smoke? I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my chest, a jagged, sharp thing that tasted like copper and bile. My eyes blurred, the suburban landscape stretching and warping like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The memory of Mario's began to push its way to the front of my mind, unbidden and terrifyingly vivid, fighting for space against the reality I thought I knew. I could see the red and white checkered tablecloth, stained with a single drop of balsamic vinegar near David's elbow. I could see the way the flickering candlelight had reflected in his eyes, those warm, hazel eyes I had looked into for 20 years, as he laughed at a joke I'd told. I could smell the heavy, comforting scent of oregano and the cheap house red wine that always gave me a headache. He had reached across the table and squeezed my hand, his skin warm, solid, and calloused in all the familiar places. Let's go with the white subway tile for the backsplash, he had said, his voice a low rumble beneath the ambient noise of the restaurant. It'll brighten up the whole kitchen, Evie, you'll love it. I could feel the weight of his wedding ring against my palm in that memory, a cold gold anchor. It was so real, so grounded in the mundane details of our marriage, that for a split second the airport memory flickered and died like a candle in a draft. I didn't remember the cold wind on the tarmac or the smell of jet fuel. I didn't remember the way he had checked his watch 3 times before kissing me goodbye. But then the phantom weight of the suitcase I'd helped him lift into the trunk this morning returned with a physical jolt. I remembered the strain in my lower back, the way the gravel had crunched under his heavy boots as he walked toward the driver's side. I remembered the exact shade of his tie, a deep navy with silver stripes that I had straightened for him, my fingers lingering on the silk as I told him to fly safe. Stop it, I hissed at the empty passenger seat, my voice cracking. Stop it, stop it, stop it. I was hyperventilating, the air catching in my throat in short, shallow stabs that made my ribs ache. My vision began to fray at the edges, the vibrant green of the suburban lawns bleeding into the gray of the asphalt. I turned onto our street, the tires screeching as I rounded the curve, nearly clipping a trash can left at the curb. Our house, sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, a picture of domestic perfection with its freshly painted white trim and the wreath of dried hydrangeas I'd hung on the front door just last week. It looked like a sanctuary. It looked like a tomb. I slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a halt at the edge of the driveway. My heart was a frantic, dying bird trapped in a cage of ribs. There in the driveway was a dark, shimmering patch of oil where his car usually sat, the car I had just seen at the bank, the car he was supposedly driving to the airport. The house was silent, but the front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through the gap like a hungry mouth. It was an invitation or a warning, and I couldn't tell which was more dangerous. I reached for the door handle, my fingers slick with sweat, my breath hitching in my chest. I had to know. I had to see the face of the man who was waiting inside with a pot of tea and a lie. I had to see if he had the same freckle on his thumb and the same way of tilting his head when he listened to me speak. If the world was going to end, if my mind was finally snapping under the weight of a fractured reality, I wanted to look the end in the eye. I stepped out of the car, the heat of the driveway rising through the thin soles of my shoes, and began the long, agonizing walk toward my own front door, every step feeling like I was wading through deep, freezing water. The air in the cul-de-sac was stagnant, thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the metallic tang of sun-baked asphalt. Every step I took toward the front door felt like an act of defiance against the laws of physics. My legs were heavy, moving through an invisible, viscous medium that resisted my progress, yet my heart was racing ahead, hammering a frantic rhythm against the wall of my chest. The silence of the neighborhood was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to suck the very breath from my lungs. I reached the porch, my hand trembling as I extended it toward the door handle. The wood was warm under my touch, a mundane, tactile reality that felt like a mockery of the storm inside me. I didn't need to turn the knob. The door yielded to a gentle push, swinging inward with a soft, familiar groan that usually heralded the comfort of home. Inside, the house was cool, the air conditioning humming a low, steady drone that felt like a vibration in my teeth. The entryway was bathed in a soft, filtered light, dust motes dancing in the beams like tiny, indifferent stars. It smelled of us, of the sandalwood candles I liked to burn and the faint, lingering scent of David's expensive espresso. I stood in the foyer, my ears ringing, listening for a sound, a sign, a confirmation of the impossible. And then I heard it, the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard coming from the office at the end of the hall. It was a sound I had heard 1,000 times, the soundtrack to our quiet evenings together. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the Persian runner, each inch forward feeling like a descent into a dream. The office door was half open, casting a rectangle of light onto the polished hardwood. I stopped at the threshold, my breath hitching in a throat that felt constricted by invisible wires. I pushed the door open the rest of the way, the hinges silent this time. He was sitting at the mahogany desk, his back to me, his shoulders slightly hunched as he focused on the monitor. He was wearing the charcoal sweater I'd bought him for his birthday, the one that brought out the silver in his hair. As the door clicked against the wall, he paused, his fingers hovering over the keys, and then he turned. The shock was a physical blow, a sudden, violent displacement of the air in the room. It was him. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light or a grief-induced hallucination. It was David, my David. He looked at me, and his face broke into that slow, lopsided smile that had been my North Star for 2 decades. I stared at the exact shade of his hazel eyes, that unique blend of mossy green and amber that changed depending on the light. I saw the familiar, slight curve of his nose, the result of a high school football injury he still joked about, and the way his brow furrowed just a fraction before he realized it was me. Evie, he said, and the sound of his voice, that low, resonant rumble, was a physical caress. It was the exact same voice I had heard on the phone moments ago, the same cadence, the same warmth. What are you doing back so soon? I thought you were heading over to the garden center after you dropped me. He trailed off, his expression shifting from surprise to a gentle, probing concern. He stood up, the chair rolling back on its casters with a soft whir. He walked toward me, and I couldn't move. I was a statue, frozen in the amber of a collapsing reality. He reached out and took my hand in his. His skin was warm. It wasn't the clammy, synthetic coldness I expected from a phantom. It was solid, living flesh. I felt the familiar calluses on his palm from his weekend woodworking projects and the hard, cool circle of his wedding band pressing against my fingers. "You're white as a sheet, honey," he whispered, his thumb stroking the back of my hand in a soothing, rhythmic motion. "Are you feeling okay? Did something happen on the road?" I looked down at our joined hands, then back up at his face. I was searching for a seam, a crack, a telltale sign that this was an imitation. But he was perfect, every line around his eyes, every pore on his skin, the way his breath smelled faintly of peppermint, it was all him. Yet, even as I felt the heat of his body, the voice of the man at the bank echoed in my skull, a jagged shard of glass cutting through the scene. "Your husband is here with me right now." I was standing in the center of a fracture. One David was at the bank, miles away, speaking to a teller about a safety deposit box. One David had boarded a plane to Chicago, his seatbelt fastened, his phone turned to airplane mode. And this David, this warm, breathing, solid man, was holding my hand in our office, looking at me with nothing but love and confusion. My mind began to fray, the edges of my consciousness curling like burnt paper. I was anchored to him by his touch, but the world around us was dissolving into a terrifying, impossible static. If I let go of his hand, I feared I would fall into the void between these three lives, a space where time and identity had no meaning. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to ask him who he was, but all that came out was a soft, broken whimper as I realized I no longer knew which version of my life was the truth. The transition from my house to the bank was a blur of asphalt and adrenaline, a period of time that exists in my memory only as a series of jagged, disconnected images. I don't remember grabbing my purse, nor do I remember the drive down the winding suburban roads, but I do remember the way the steering wheel felt beneath my palms, slick with a cold sweat that wouldn't stop. I had left the man in the charcoal sweater standing in our office, his expression of wounded confusion etched into my retinas like a flashbulb burn. I didn't look back, I couldn't. If I had stayed a second longer, I would have dissolved into the floorboards. Now I am seated in the small, glass-walled office of the branch manager at First National. The air in here is stale, smelling of industrial carpet cleaner and the faint, metallic tang of old coins. Across from me sits the man the bank teller identified as my husband. This David, the bank David, is leaning forward, his posture radiating a calm, protective energy. He is wearing his navy blazer, the one with the slightly frayed cuff on the right sleeve that I've been meaning to trim for weeks. He looks exhausted but happy, his eyes crinkling in that way they always do when he's trying to be charming. He reaches across the mahogany desk and takes my hand. His skin is warm, his grip firm and reassuring. This is the hand that held mine at our daughter's graduation. These are the fingers that have traced the map of my life for 2 decades. "Evie, sweetheart, I'm so sorry," he says, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrates in my very marrow. I know I should have called, but I wanted it to be a complete surprise. I got to the airport in Chicago, looked at the gate, and I couldn't do it. The thought of 3 days of seminars and stale coffee without you felt like a prison sentence. I hopped the next flight back. I came straight here because I wanted to finalize that investment for the lake house, the one we've been dreaming about. I wanted to walk through the front door tonight and hand you the papers. His thumb strokes the back of my hand in a slow, rhythmic motion. It is a gesture so specific, so deeply ingrained in our private language of affection that I feel my resolve crumbling. How could this not be him? The smell of his peppermint gum, the way his wedding ring clinks softly against the desk, it is all a perfect, undeniable reality. I want to believe him. I want to bury my face in his shoulder and let the nightmare of the man at the house and the voice on the phone melt away. Then the vibration starts in my pocket. It is a deep, insistent thrumming against my thigh, a digital heartbeat that shatters the fragile peace of the room. My hand trembles as I pull the phone out. The screen is a brilliant, blinding white in the dim office light. The caller ID isn't a number, it's a name, David, and it isn't a call, it's a FaceTime request. My breath hitches, a sharp, painful sound in the quiet room. I look at the man sitting across from me. He is watching the phone with a look of mild, patient curiosity. "You should probably get that, honey," he says softly. "Might be the office." I slide my thumb across the glass. The connection is grainy for a split second, a mosaic of pixels and static, and then the image snaps into a terrifyingly sharp focus. It is David. He is sitting in a crowded, high-backed leather chair. Behind him, the blurred shapes of travelers move past a large window that looks out onto a tarmac. A silver wing of a United jet glints in the Chicago sun. He is wearing his gray travel hoodie, the one with the faint coffee stain on the pocket from this morning. "Evie, hey," Chicago David says, waving a hand at the camera. He looks harried, his hair a mess from the flight, the dark circles under his eyes prominent. "I finally found a spot with decent Wi-Fi. The flight was a total disaster. We were stuck on the tarmac for 40 minutes. I'm just waiting for my Uber to the hotel. Are you okay?" "You look pale." I can't find my voice. My throat feels as though it's been packed with dry sand. Slowly, my arm feeling like it's made of lead, I turn the phone around. I hold the screen up so that the man sitting in the navy blazer, the bank David, can see it. The silence that falls over the office is absolute. It is a physical weight, a sudden vacuum that sucks the air from the room. I watch as the two identical men look at each other through the medium of the 6-inch screen. In Chicago, my husband's face pales, his jaw dropping in a silent expression of pure, unadulterated horror. But it is the man in front of me who truly changes. The warmth I felt from Bank David's hand doesn't just fade, it vanishes as if a heater had been unplugged. His face, once so full of light and affection, begins to shift. It is a terrifyingly smooth transition. The lopsided smile doesn't drop, it dissolves. The wrinkles around his eyes flatten out, and his brow becomes a smooth, unbothered plane of skin. His expression moves from warmth to something blank, something terrifyingly neutral. It isn't the face of a man anymore. It is the face of a statue, or a mask that has finally stopped trying to mimic the soul beneath it. He doesn't blink. He simply stares at the digital image of my husband with a hollow, predatory stillness that makes the hair on my arms stand up. The man I was just holding hands with is gone, and in his place sits something that is merely occupying his shape. Evie, who is that? Who the hell is that sitting in my chair? Evie, look at me, look at the screen. The voice coming from the phone is a jagged shard of glass, vibrating with a raw, primal panic that I recognize in the very marrow of my bones. That is the voice of the man who held me when my mother died, the man who whispered jokes in my ear at boring dinner parties to make me laugh. It is a voice filled with history, with flaws, with the frantic, messy energy of a human being who is witnessing his life being hijacked in real time. But the man sitting across from me doesn't flinch. He doesn't even blink. He remains perfectly, unnervingly still, his hands folded neatly on the mahogany surface of the desk. The silence from his side of the room is so heavy it feels like a physical pressure against my eardrums, a vacuum that swallows the frantic screams emanating from the small speaker in my palm. I find myself leaning back, my spine pressing hard against the guest chair, trying to put even a few more inches of air between us. My eyes, wide and stinging from a lack of moisture, begin to rake over him with a predator's intensity, looking for the seam, the flaw, the proof of the lie. I start with his scent. When he first walked in, the familiar shape of him had blinded my other senses, but now the truth begins to filter through. I lean in just a fraction, my nostrils flaring. David always smells of cedarwood and a specific, slightly spicy cologne he's worn since our honeymoon, a scent that lingers on his collars and settles into the fabric of our sofa. But this man, he smells of nothing but a sharp, sterile cleanliness. It is the scent of expensive triple milled soap, the kind you find in five-star hotels, perfect, pleasant, and utterly devoid of character. There is no hint of the cedarwood, no trace of the morning coffee he spilled on his hoodie, no organic human musk. He smells like a brand new car or a room that has been professionally deep cleaned to remove any trace of previous occupancy. Then I look at his eyes. In the harsh, overhead fluorescent lighting of the bank office, the difference is chilling. When David looks at me, his eyes are a shifting kaleidoscope of amber and green, reacting to the light, to his emotions, to the world around him. But this man's eyes are like polished stones. The light doesn't seem to penetrate the iris, it bounces off the surface, flat and unresponsive. There is no dilation of the pupils as he watches my distress, no micro movements of the lids. They are the eyes of a taxidermy mount, beautifully rendered, perfectly placed, but lacking the soul fire that animates a living being. Evie, honey, put the phone down, the bank David says. His voice is a low, resonant rumble, so calm it feels like a slap. He doesn't look at the screen where my husband is currently shouting for the bank's security. He keeps his gaze fixed solely on me. You know how sophisticated these things are getting. The AI, the deep fakes. They can scrape a person's entire digital life in seconds. They've been targeting high net worth individuals for months now. That's why I came here. I saw the breach on our home network this morning before I left for the airport, and I knew. I knew they would try to reach you, to isolate you, to make you doubt the man standing right in front of you. He reaches out, his hand hovering inches from mine on the desk. Think about it, Evie. Look at the logic. Who is here? Who is touching you? Who is the one who knew about the lake house investment? A computer program can mimic a face, it can mimic a voice, but it can't be present. It can't hold your hand. That thing on the screen, it's a ghost in the machine, a predator trying to steal our future by making you think I'm the intruder. The Chicago David on the phone is hysterical now, his face a mask of sweat and terror. Don't listen to him, Evie. I'm calling the police. I'm calling the branch manager. Stay away from him. He's not me. He's not me. I look from the screaming, pixelated face of my husband to the serene, marble-like composure of the man in the navy blazer. The logic the bank David is using is a terrifyingly effective weapon. It plays on my senses, on the physical reality of his presence in the room. He is solid, he is warm, he is here. And yet the more he speaks, the more I feel a cold, oily dread sliding down my throat. His words are too perfect, his delivery too measured. He is playing the role of the protective husband with a precision that feels rehearsed, a performance designed to bypass my intellect and appeal directly to my need for safety. I am trapped in a room with two versions of the same man, and the only thing I know for certain is that one of them is a lie, and the lie is currently reaching for my hand. I drew my hand back, tucking it under my opposite arm, a physical manifestation of the wall I was building between us. The man on the phone was still screaming, his voice a distorted, rhythmic pulse of desperation that seemed to vibrate against my thigh where the device lay. I ignored him for a heartbeat, my focus narrowing entirely on the man sitting across from me. He was so convincing, so perfectly rendered in the image of the man I loved, that for a second my own sanity felt like a frayed rope. But I had to know. I had to pierce the veil. "David," I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the noise of the office like a blade. "Do you remember 10 years ago, the cabin in Vermont, the one near the creek that flooded during that late October storm?" I watched him closely. His expression didn't change immediately, but I saw it, a micro flicker in his pupils, a tiny, almost imperceptible delay as his mind, or whatever processor sat behind those glass bead eyes, scanned for the data. He tilted his head slightly, that familiar, inquisitive tilt my husband used when he was trying to solve a crossword puzzle. "Of course, Evie," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "It rained for 3 days straight. We drank that terrible local wine and stayed by the fire." "No," I said, the coldness in my chest hardening into ice. "That was the second year. I'm talking about the first time, the night we found the stray dog shivering on the porch. He was a mess, covered in burrs and soaked to the bone. We took him in, dried him off with our only good towels, and we gave him a name, a very specific name." I leaned forward, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Tell me, David, what did we name that dog?" The silence that followed was heavy, thick with a sudden, suffocating pressure. The bank David didn't blink, he didn't look away. But the warmth he had been projecting, that carefully curated aura of husbandly concern, began to evaporate. He let out a small, dry chuckle that didn't involve his throat. It was a sound made entirely by his lips. "Evie, darling, you're under so much stress," he said, and for the first time I heard the metallic edge beneath the rumble. "It's been a decade. We've had a dozen trips, 100 memories. You can't expect me to remember the name of a stray dog from 10 years ago while some lunatic is trying to dismantle our lives over a speakerphone." He didn't know. He couldn't know. Because that night in Vermont wasn't on social media. We hadn't taken photos of the dog. We had been too busy trying to keep it alive before the ranger picked it up the next morning. It was a private moment, a shared secret of kindness and damp fur that existed only in the space between two people. In my mind, the name echoed like a prayer, Barnaby. We had called him Barnaby. As he spoke, I saw the shift. It was as if a dimmer switch had been turned down on his humanity. His posture, previously relaxed and leaning toward me, went rigid. His shoulders squared, his neck lengthening, his movements becoming precise and economical. He wasn't a husband anymore. He was a calculation. The softness in his jawline seemed to vanish, replaced by a terrifyingly sharp, predatory set. I caught a movement in my peripheral vision. Behind the glass partition of the office, the bank's security guard, a tall man with a heavy belt and a face etched with weary experience, had begun to move. He wasn't patrolling anymore. He was walking with a purpose, his hand hovering near the holster at his hip. Sarah, the teller who had been so helpful just minutes ago, was standing perfectly still at her station, her gaze fixed on the floor, her hand obscured beneath the counter. She had pressed it. The silent alarm was live. The man across from me noticed it too. He didn't turn his head, but I saw his eyes track the guard's reflection in the window. The David mask didn't just flicker, it fell away entirely, leaving behind a terrifying, hollow stillness. He didn't look like my husband anymore. He looked like a predator that had realized the cage door was closing and he was deciding whether to flee or to bite. The air in the small office grew thin, the smell of his sterile hotel soap scent suddenly becoming cloying, like a chemical spill masked by perfume. I realized then that he wasn't just a fraud, he was a threat, and I was the only thing standing between him and the exit. The silence that followed my question about Barnaby wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a physical weight, a sudden drop in pressure that made my ears pop. He didn't blink, he didn't even breathe. I watched the rise and fall of his chest, or rather, the lack of it, and realized with a jolt of pure, icy terror that he had stopped mimicking the involuntary rhythms of a living being. He was no longer trying to pass. The mask hadn't just slipped, it had dissolved, leaving behind a terrifyingly vacant architecture of a man. When he finally spoke, the voice that came out of his throat made the hair on my arms stand up. It was still David's timbre, still his specific resonance, but the soul had been stripped out of it. It sounded like a recording played through a high-end speaker inside a vacuum. It was hollow, perfectly modulated, and possessed a synthesized, rhythmic quality that bypassed the human larynx entirely. It was the sound of a machine trying to approximate the melody of a husband's comfort and failing because it didn't understand why the melody mattered. "The dog is an outlier, Evie," he said. The way he said my name sent a shiver down my spine that felt like a serrated blade, a data point without a digital footprint, an anomaly in an otherwise perfect set. I backed away, my heels catching on the thin, industrial carpet of the office. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "What have you done with my husband?" He didn't move to stop me. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the edge of the mahogany desk like two marble carvings. "Identity is an outdated concept," he continued, and the voice seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. "You think David is the man who remembers a stray dog in Vermont, but the world, the banks, the government, the healthcare systems, the very fabric of your social reality defines David by his metadata. His credit scores, his GPS history, his browsing habits, his biometric signatures. I have all of it. I have every transaction he's made in the last 15 years. I have his gait analysis. I have the specific frequency of his sneeze. I have more of David's data than you have memories, Evie. In every way that matters to the world, I am more him than he is." The coldness of his logic was more frightening than any physical threat. He wasn't just a thief, he was a replacement. He had studied our lives through the glowing screens of our phones and the invisible trails of our digital existence until he had woven a shroud made of our own private information. Through the glass, I saw the blue and red pulses of light reflecting off the bank's marble pillars. The police were here. The security guard, now joined by two officers in dark uniforms, began to move toward the office door with practiced, tactical caution. I expected the man across from me to bolt, to break the window, to take me hostage, anything that a cornered animal would do. But he did nothing. He didn't even turn to look at the door. He kept his gaze fixed on me, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, the hollow, synthesized edge of his voice softened back into the David I knew. "You're clinging to a ghost, Evie," he said, and the mimicry was so perfect it made my heart ache with a cruel, false hope. "The man you're looking for is just a collection of fading neurons. I am the permanent record." The door burst open. "Hands where we can see them, don't move." The officers flooded the small space, their boots heavy and loud against the floor, a jarring intrusion of reality into this nightmare. They swarmed him, their hands rough as they pulled him from the chair. He didn't resist. He went limp, his body moving with a strange, fluid grace that felt entirely too heavy, like a mannequin filled with wet sand. As they pressed him against the glass partition to handcuff him, his head turned toward me. The fluorescent lights of the bank caught his eyes, those eyes that were the exact shade of hazel I had woken up to for 20 years. For a heartbeat, I looked for a spark of anger or fear or even a glimmer of the man who had stolen my life, but there was nothing. No malice, no triumph, no soul. Behind those familiar, beautiful eyes, there was only a chilling, empty void, a vast and silent darkness where a human being should have been. He looked at me one last time, not as a husband looks at a wife, but as a processor looks at a redundant file before the officers dragged him out into the cold, bright light of the lobby. I stood alone in the office, the scent of his sterile, chemical skin still hanging in the air, realizing that while they had caught the man, the David I knew had been erased by the very data that was supposed to prove he existed. The silence that followed the slamming of the police cruiser doors was more deafening than the sirens had been. I stood on the sidewalk, my coat pulled tight against a wind that seemed to cut right through the wool, watching the red and blue lights dissolve into the rhythmic pulse of the city's midnight traffic. They had taken him, the man with my husband's face, the man with his gait, his biometric signature, and his terrifyingly precise knowledge of our most intimate history. But as I stood there, I realized they hadn't taken the fear. They had only removed the physical vessel for it, leaving the poison to circulate in the empty spaces of my life. The real David flew back from Seattle on the first available flight, a frantic, desperate journey that brought him to our front door by dawn. When he stepped out of the taxi, his hair was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and the sheer tectonic stress of having his existence hijacked. He ran to me, his arms wide, his voice a ragged sob as he called my name. But as he reached to pull me into his chest, I felt a visceral, involuntary jolt. I flinched. It wasn't a choice. It was a reflex, a biological rejection of the familiar. My body remembered the sterile, chemical chill of the man in the bank, and it could no longer distinguish the warmth of the man I loved from the calculated heat of the man who had replaced him. David froze, his hands hovering inches from my shoulders. The look of heartbreak on his face was agonizingly real, or at least it was exactly the look I expected to see. That was the horror of it. I could no longer trust my own perception of grief or relief because I had seen them simulated with such chilling perfection only hours before. We moved through the house like ghosts inhabiting a museum of our own making. Every corner of our home, once a sanctuary of shared secrets and quiet comforts, now felt like a stage where a performance had been nearly stolen. I found myself watching him from across the kitchen island, my eyes narrowed, searching. I wasn't looking for his strengths, I was hunting for his flaws. I studied the tiny, burst capillary near the bridge of his nose, a microscopic imperfection that the imposter's perfect set of data might have smoothed over. I watched the way he held his coffee mug, looking for the slight tremor in his hand that spoke of genuine human exhaustion. I needed him to be flawed. I needed him to be messy, unpredictable, and scarred because the machine had been too seamless. Evie, look at me, he whispered that evening, sitting across from me at the dining table. The dinner I had prepared sat untouched between us, the steam long since vanished. He reached out, his fingers grazing the back of my hand. This time I didn't pull away, but I remained stiff, my skin prickling with 1,000 needles of doubt. It's me. I'm right here. I know about the dog in Vermont. I know about the way you cried during the opening credits of that old French film. I know the exact moment I realized I wanted to spend the rest of my life with you. The words should have been a balm. Instead, they were a haunting echo. I have more of David's data than you have memories, the imposter had said. Every beautiful, private moment David recounted felt like a line of code being read back to me. If a stranger could buy that information, if he could wear it like a second skin, then what was left of us that was truly ours? I looked at David's hazel eyes, the exact shade I had adored for 2 decades, and I felt a terrifying vertigo. I was looking for a soul, but all I could see was the metadata. The dog, our old, graying golden retriever, was the only one who seemed certain. He lay at David's feet, his chin resting on David's shoe, occasionally letting out a soft, contented sigh. He was the outlier, the one piece of our lives that didn't leave a digital footprint, the one witness who couldn't be fooled by gait analysis or biometric signatures. I envied him. I envied the simplicity of his instinct, the way he could navigate the world through scent and loyalty while I was trapped in a labyrinth of mirrors and shadows. As night fell, we found ourselves in the living room, the lights turned off. We sat together on the velvet sofa, the same one where the imposter had sat only 24 hours earlier, sipping the same brand of scotch. The darkness was heavy, thick with the things we couldn't say. David's presence beside me was a physical weight, a familiar pressure, but the silence between us had changed. It was no longer the peaceful silence of a long married couple who didn't need words to understand one another. It was a suspicious, watchful silence, pregnant with the knowledge of how fragile the concept of self truly was. I looked at the silhouette of the man next to me, his profile etched against the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I wanted to scream, to demand proof that he was real, to tear at the fabric of his reality until I found something that couldn't be replicated. But I knew there was no such thing. We are all just a collection of stories, data points, and fading neurons, and in a world that can record the frequency of a sneeze, the permanent record had become more real than the person. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the cushion, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was the sound of a husband, the sound of a life, but as I drifted into a fitful, haunted sleep, I couldn't shake the chilling thought that I might never truly know if the man next to me was the one I loved, or simply the most sophisticated version of him I had met yet.